Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar Working with Immigrant Victims of Labor Trafficking. My name is Liesl Zamora. I am a staff attorney for Standpoint. Specifically, I am the Youth Labor Trafficking Project Attorney. I help represent immigrants who have been victims of labor trafficking, who are 24 years old and under. And for those of you who are not familiar with Standpoint as an organization, we work to promote justice for domestic and sexual violence victims, providing limited direct representation, legal information, training, litigation support, and expert support on program and legal issues. This webinar, as I stated, is specifically about working with victims who have been involved in labor trafficking. And before we get started on the actual webinar, my coworker Ty is going to have a little bit of information for you all.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ty Cinnabon. I'm the Advocate Support Program Manager here at Standpoint. My role today in this webinar is in helping facilitate the questions portion of the webinar. Should any of you have any questions, please type your question under the questions tab in the control panel. Lisa will be checking in with me periodically throughout her presentation to answer any questions that you may have. But before I do let Lisa start her presentation, I have a few poll questions for all of you to answer. This helps Lisa know the audience she is presenting to. So I'm going to start the poll now. And the first poll question I have is, have you ever worked with someone who was trafficked? And just answer yes or no. Okay. So I'm going to close out that poll. And the result of the poll is we have 100% of the responses saying yes. Yes, that they have worked with someone who was trafficked. Okay, and so I also have the second poll question, which is, have you worked with immigrant clients? And again, it's just a yes or no answer. Okay, and I'll close that out. And the response is yes, 100% of you have worked with immigrant clients. And our third poll question is, do you currently provide services to immigrant clients? And it's, again, a yes or no question. Okay, and 100% of you answered that you do currently work with immigrant clients. So this webinar then should provide you with lots of information on assisting the clients that you are currently serving. So thank you for all your responses. This webinar is being recorded. And I will upload it to our YouTube channel in the next week. I always email the recordings out on our listserv as well. And if you aren't already subscribed to our listserv or our YouTube channel and you want to subscribe, just connect with me after the webinar and I can give you details on how to subscribe. Also, if there's a topic you would like a training on, please don't hesitate to let me know. Standpoint is here to be a resource for advocates around the state. So that's all that I have. I'm going to go ahead now and pass the mic on to Lisa so that she can start the webinar.
Okay, so let's get started. Just a bit of an overview. of what we're going to be talking about. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what is trafficking, the definitions that we use in immigration cases looking at trafficking, what kind of examples does it look like, where are trafficking victims most often found, what immigration remedies are available for victims of labor trafficking, and then working with victims and attorneys, and finally at the end a couple of case examples. So the federal definition of trafficking is what we look at in an immigration case for when we have a victim of trafficking. There are two kinds of trafficking in the federal definition. One is sex trafficking, which we're just going to go over briefly, and then there's labor trafficking. Sex trafficking is when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person who's induced to perform the act is under 18 years of age. And then labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, with the purpose being for subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. These definitions, as shown, come from U.S. Federal regulations. So this is the federal definition of trafficking. Minnesota does have slightly different definitions, but they're just basically end up being more broad to include even more people under the Minnesota definition. So as seen on the little graphic at the bottom of this slide as well, trafficking breaks down in basically being an action, means, for a purpose. So either the action, recruiting, transporting, providing, obtaining, all of those words, by a means, which is force, fraud, or coercion, unless it's sex trafficking and the person's under 18 years of age, for a purpose, which is either commercial sex acts or labor services. So let's go a little bit more in depth about those definitions. So sex trafficking specifically is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, and obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. And then a commercial sex act is any sex act which is on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. Now, anything of value is not defined in regulation, and so that could be a variety of things that would then turn this interchange into sex trafficking. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those examples could be in a little bit. Now, the definitions for labor trafficking are a bit more substantial, as you could see from the slide. The federal definition includes either being for the purpose of debt bondage, involuntary servitude, peonage, or slavery. Slavery, the definition is not listed in the federal regulations, but probably because most people understand what slavery is and means. But the debt bondage all have their own definitions. They're all pretty similar. Debt bondage is the status of a debtor arising from a pledge by that person to his or her personal services or those of another person who is under their control as security for a debt. And then if the value of that is not applied towards either lowering the debt or the length and nature of the services are not limited or defined. So basically, if somebody owes a debt and because of that pledges themselves to work to pay off that debt and then it never gets either never gets paid off, or maybe it does slowly go down, but there's no sort of limit or definition on when it will ever end. Involuntary servitude is basically forced labor. It can be, the full definition is there on the slide, but it basically is any scheme or plan that makes a person believe that if they don't start or continue this work, that either they or another person would suffer serious harm or physical restraint or abuse of the legal process. And so this can either cause them to start the work, or they might have started work and then feel unable to leave because of these threats. And then the last definition for peonage is basically the same as involuntary servitude, except that that it is based upon indebtedness, so a debt. So what, well, first of all, are there any questions about those definitions?
No questions yet, Lisa.
Okay. So what does trafficking look like? Basically, sex trafficking, as I stated before, is that has the element of the Commercial Sex Act. And when you look at anything of value that's being exchanged for sex or sexual touching, that can be, obviously money is something of value, but it can also be something that people don't necessarily think about, like housing or drugs or even protection, food, different things like that. And again, even if there is no force, fraud, or coercion used for sex trafficking, if the person who is induced to perform the sex act is under 18 years of age, no matter if they did it of their own free will, it is still considered sex trafficking if they're exchanging if they're either recruited, harbored, any of those, what was included in the definition for a commercial sex act. So if they're recruited to exchange sex for housing, then it still would count as sex trafficking, even if there was no sort of force involved with it. Now, labor trafficking, they do have to have the element of the force, fraud, or coercion, even if the person is 18 or under. And so even if the person is a youth, there's still the force, fraud, or coercion. Now, the debt bondage, like I stated a little bit before, is basically owing large sums of money. And then even if you're paying on that debt, it never seems to lessen the amount of it, or there's no end in sight for when that's going to be paid off. And so they just continually keep the person in this bondage, basically, to continue to pay money, and usually end up paying way more than they probably ever owed. Involuntary servitude, as I stated before, is basically forced labor. The person feels unable to leave either because of threats to them or to someone close to them or someone they know. So that could be family members or a friend or fellow workers, anything like that. And then same thing for peonage, the same thing except that it's based on the debt, and then feeling that they cannot leave even if they've been paying on the debt, just because they feel that they are being threatened, that they need to stay in that job. Examples of what force, fraud, or coercion can look like. The most obvious and probably frequent example in immigration cases are threats to either call the police or immigration if the person either tries to get into a better situation in that work, either get a different job or just threatening to leave, then they might be threatened with deportation or calling immigration or the police. Another thing that can happen are threats to themselves or their family or friends. Again, just threatening that, we know where your family lives in your home country. We know if it's a debt situation, they might threaten to, make the family who is probably very short on money having to pay that. And if they can't, then they might have some sort of physical punishment for not being able to pay. And because this person then won't pay the debt or continue to work to pay the debt. Also, just controlling their movements, controlling when the person can go out, holding on to their immigration documents. Even if they don't have a visa, they might have a visa, but even if they don't, just holding on to any sort of ID that they did have, their passport or their birth certificate, or some people have a credencial from their country, just a general ID from their country. If they don't, they might feel trapped and not able to leave because they don't have any sort of way to identify themselves. And how are they going to look for any sort of better situation when they don't have that? So some risk factors that can lead to people being trafficked. Poverty is a huge one. People who are in a desperate situation and need money are willing to accept conditions that they may know and understand are unfair and that they shouldn't have to deal with, but because they feel like they need the money or that their family needs the money, then they will do it anyway. Isolation, having no sort of support network can this kind of goes with that last one, which is unstable family or lack of support. If the person doesn't have family to help them or a support system, if they're isolated in where they are, which can be because of various others of these risk factors, then they are much more likely to be a victim. Having a history of abuse or chemical dependency, being disabled and not having the ability to advocate for themselves, lacking immigration status. Again, that makes them very vulnerable to a lot of the threats that are used by traffickers to keep them where they are and keep them working in a situation that they might understand and know is not fair. Cultural background, sometimes traffickers are relatives. And so having the cultural understanding that you obey your elders and that you do what they say. And maybe this is their grandparent, or maybe it's their parent or an older relative. And so even though it's not a typical situation, they feel that they have to keep doing it because they have to respect their elders. Homelessness and having an LGBTQ identity can also be risk factors, especially for sex trafficking, but also for labor trafficking, just leading them into more vulnerable situations, having the desperation for any sort of income or what they see as a more stable situation that maybe that they had before, can all lead them to being stuck in. Or sometimes traffickers even have these propositions saying, oh, well, you'll get all this money if you do this job, or this, something that just seems too good to be true. And because they've had either a very impoverished upbringing or they don't have a place to stay, and housing is being offered as part of this, then they are much more vulnerable to being taken in by these kind of schemes. So common industries that labor trafficking, or well, actually any trafficking can come up in is domestic workers, people who work in homes, but also any other sort of cleaning, uh, hotel services, working in cleaning hotels, factory workers, migrant farm workers especially. Um, Often people do actually come on a visa, but then it is not what they were promised, and it leads to them still being in a trafficking situation, even if they might have come specifically with a visa to do this kind of work, but it is not what they were promised or told they would get. Gangs can be a common industry for trafficking. They can, often take people in and then force them to sell drugs or bring drugs across the border. Some people are so desperate to get into the country that, and then they're threatened that the only way that they will be able to is if they do this work for the people who are bringing them in, and then have to carry backpacks, carry different things into the country. Sex workers, obviously, is sex trafficking, forcing somebody into providing sex services. Construction is also a common area where labor trafficking is found, and restaurant workers as well. Ty, are there any questions yet?
No questions yet, Lisa.
Okay, so we'll just keep going then. So a common situation that can arise and that often confuses people is that there can be an overlap between domestic violence and trafficking. People often come in for help and might only recognize that they need help for some sort of situation of domestic or family violence, and not acknowledge or even realize that they are also being trafficked in the same situation. So a couple of examples of how this can work is, one of the most obvious examples is somebody meeting their boyfriend, and then it turns into well, if you love me, then you'll do this, with my dealer so that we can both get drugs, or having sex with the landlord so that we don't have to pay rent this month, and then forcing them into this kind of situation and coercing them because of the relationship, the intimate relationship that they have. For labor trafficking, what can happen is, a new wife might be forced to become a domestic servant in her household for either her husband or his family, rather than being the person in control in their household, they end up being the servant and having to endure abuse by their husband, but then having to do exaggeratingly more services within the home than somebody would normally do. Also, a child being forced to work multiple jobs by a parent, turning over all her earnings to her parent, and then threatening her if she doesn't want to continue working. Excuse me. Also, if a child, one thing that I've seen several times happen is a child coming to the US who thinks that they're going to come live here with a family member and study, but then they get here and then instead they're instead of studying or in addition to studying, they're then forced to do some sort of labor. So like coming in thinking you're going to live with uncle and study and go to school, learn English, but instead being forced to run uncle's restaurant. Now, I'm pretty sure everybody's probably familiar with the power and control wheel, and there is one specific for trafficking. It does have a good explanation of a lot of the ways that you can see the force, fraud, or coercion on the inside of the wheel, which then leads to the uh, end of either sex trafficking or labor trafficking. So either the working in the businesses, farms, domestic work, begging, stripping, sex trade, brothels. The only thing it doesn't really include is the beginning part of the definition. But it does have really good examples of how these are, how the force, fraud, and coercion can play out. So the humiliation that can happen with the emotional abuse, the playing mind games with people, making them feel that really this was all them, or that they brought this on themselves, intimidation, the physical abuse that can keep people there, and just how a lot of it can add together, either the economic, physical, and emotional all together or separate. And obviously then includes the threats to call immigration or reporting to police, threatening to expose or shame them. One thing I didn't mention before about the cultural component, making people more vulnerable, as well as if, you know, if they've been in perhaps a sexual relationship with somebody and that person took pictures or you know, videos or anything, then they might use those as a way to keep that person not only, you know, controlling them as in a domestic violence relationship, but also using that to keep them doing the work that they were working, and making them not feeling like they can leave, because otherwise this information will be released to their community and they'll have this intense shame. A lot of immigrant communities are very close knit, and so having this released into the community could really damage a person's reputation and feel like they hadn't, you know, nowhere to go or nobody to help them, because they'll be so shamed within the community. So let's look at some immigration remedies for people who've been trafficked. The first one is a T visa, which is a 4-year non-immigrant status. Actually, it's not really a visa, it's a status that people can get. And it's available to people who have been victims of a severe form of trafficking in persons. The second would be potentially a U visa, which most people have heard of. It's a 4-year, also non-immigrant status that's available for people who've been victims of certain crimes, which includes extortion, fraud and foreign labor contracting, involuntary servitude, obstruction of justice, peonage, slave trade, witness tampering, sexual assault, rape, and sexual exploitation. So a lot of some of these situations would qualify for both a U visa or a T visa. And so we're going to go over kind of what requirements are for both of them, and what differences are between them and why one might be a better idea over the other. So as it says on the slide, T visas, both T visa and U visa come out of the trafficking or out of federal law, and they're both capped annually at how many visas are available or how many people can obtain the non-immigrant status. T visas have a 5,000 annual cap, and U visas have a 10,000 annual cap. So first we'll talk a little bit about U visas. You have to have, for the process of applying, the first thing that you have to have for a U visa application is a certification that's signed by law enforcement, a judge, or a prosecutor that confirms that the applicant was a victim of a qualifying crime, possesses information about that crime, and was helpful or is being helpful or is likely to be helpful in the investigation or prosecution of the crime. So without that certification signed, it's impossible to apply for a U visa. Now, sometimes that's pretty easy to get, but from law enforcement and in some areas, law enforcement just outright refuses to sign them, or maybe only in certain cases. Or only if the person has a has no criminal record or things like that. And so sometimes it can be difficult to get that certification signed. And if you can't get it, then there's just no way to apply for the U visa. You also have to show as part of the application process that the person suffered substantial physical or mental abuse as a result of the crime that they suffered. I should point out that for the certification, it doesn't require that there is any prosecution of the crime, but if there's any sort of, as long as a person reported it, then that should count as some sort of investigation into it. But it all depends on then who would be able to sign the certification. If there's no prosecution, then obviously the prosecutor would not be able to sign, or a judge. And then as part of the U visa application, you can also include derivative family members in the application, and that includes for adults, people over 21 or 21 and older, they can have a spouse if they're married. They have to be married before the application is filed. Or minor children under 21 and under, or I'm sorry, under 21, can be also included as derivatives. If the main applicant is under 21, then they can include their parents as derivative applicants. They can also include their siblings who are minors, and they can, and their siblings. There's a waiver of certain inadmissibility requirements that is available for people who have a U visa application. This can be really helpful for people who may not qualify for other ways to obtain a lawful status in the United States, because U visa and T visa applications with the waiver that's available, more issues of inadmissibility can be waived through this application than in others. And so sometimes this is the only hope for people who have no other way to be able to obtain a waiver for something that might have happened in their past, that then makes them inadmissible to the United States and unable to get any sort of lawful status another way. U visas can also apply through what's called indirect victimization. This can be two different kinds. Either if, say, a person is pregnant and witnesses a crime happening that would qualify, and as a result of that suffers a miscarriage or something damaging happening in the pregnancy, then they could potentially qualify if they then reported and cooperated in the investigation of the crime. This can also count with parents who might have a child who is a US citizen, or spouses who have, um, it's more common with parents. Parents who have a child who is a US citizen, that something may have happened to them. The most common that I've seen is that a child is sexually abused, and then the parent is then the person who is reporting it, making sure that the child is available if law enforcement needs to talk with them, find out for the investigation. Then that parent can then qualify for a U visa application as an indirect victim because of what happened to their child, even though their child is actually a US citizen. So T visas. T visas have a slightly different application process, but it's pretty similar to the U visa as well. One distinct benefit that T visa applications might have is the ability to get what's called continued presence in some cases. So this is if the trafficking is reported and law enforcement, particularly federal law enforcement, can apply to have this person get what's called continued presence, which is basically a deferred action and allowing this person to continue in the United States while they apply for their T visa, and having basically permission to stay during that time, so that either they can investigate or just continue on with the application. The real benefit for continued presence for the applicant is that they can apply for a work permit during that time. So they can, usually during an immigration application, you have to first apply for something, wait a period of time, and then you get a work permit. But if a person who is applying for a T visa can get with this continued presence, then they're basically able to apply for a work permit immediately, and then can have that during while their application is pending, and not have to wait the entire time for the pending application. There is a certification to sign for T visas, but it is not a requirement for filing. So you can get law enforcement to sign saying that the person has been a victim of trafficking, but it isn't a requirement like it is for the U visa. So if you cannot get them to sign it, then you can still apply for the T visa. During the process of the application, you have to show that the applicant was a victim of a severe form of trafficking in persons. So basically that they fit the definition that we saw earlier in the presentation, that they are physically present in the United States on account of the trafficking, that they complied with any reasonable request for assistance in the investigation or prosecution. And there are two exceptions to that, which is the trauma exception, which basically says that if a person has suffered so much trauma that they are incapable of being able to comply with reasonable requests for assistance, then there is an exception for them. Sometimes, it's a good idea to get, sometimes it's not. And so generally that would be something that the attorney on the case would decide whether or not this person should try for the trauma exception. There is also an exception for minors. So if either if the person is under 18 when you're applying, then obviously they were trafficked when they were under 18. And so they would have this exception, but also if they're over 18 at the time of filing, but the trafficking happened when they were under 18, then they would still qualify for the exception, and not have to show that they complied with any reasonable request for assistance. So basically, you don't have to show that you reported the trafficking for a minor victim, which can be it can have advantages and disadvantages, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then finally, as part of the application, you have to also show that the person would suffer extreme hardship involving severe and unusual harm if they were removed from the United States. People who are applying for T visas can also apply for derivative family members, the same as U visa applications. And then the T visa actually has a couple of additional derivative family members that they can apply for if it is directly related to the trafficking. So if they have family members who would be in danger because of the trafficking that happened. Say, like when we talked before, that they maybe were threatening family members that still live in home country to be able to keep that person there. And so therefore they're afraid to report or do anything because they're afraid something is going to happen to their family members. Then there is the ability for them to apply for several other different kinds of derivative family members through the T visa application as well. And again, they are also able to obtain a waiver of certain grounds of inadmissibility that especially may not be available to people who are applying for other immigration remedies. Are there any questions about this?
Yes, so there is one question, Lisa, and the question is, if a client is eligible for both a U and a T visa, should they apply for both? Example is, if they're a victim of labor trafficking, should they apply for both a U and a T simultaneously?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a good idea if they are, what sometimes happens is if somebody is paying a private attorney, then they would have to pay for both applications. But if they're getting assistance through a legal service organization or somewhere where they're not having to pay a private attorney and don't have to choose one or the other, then I think it's good to apply for both because you never know. One, they might have a little bit stronger evidence for one and it might end up working out better than the other. So if you qualify for both, then you might as well apply for both.
Okay.
Any other questions?
There wasn't a follow-up question to that, so
Okay.
I'll let you know if there is.
Okay. All right. So moving on. So there are some shared advantages of both U and T visas. Like I said before, they're both 4 years of a non-immigrant status. So non-immigrant status generally means that there's not an automatic way to achieve residency through it. So both U and T visas do have the ability to become residents afterward, but it's not an automatic thing. They do have to apply for it. Whereas if you have an immigrant status, then you can automatically become a resident. So both of them also can get a work permit when the status is approved, which is good for, or they can have that during the entire period of the non-immigrant status. And they both have the ability to include derivative applications, like we said, and the ability to waive certain issues of inadmissibility. Now, the way that can work out sometimes is, for example, somebody who is, what might happen is somebody who is, say, married to a US citizen. They maybe were, they want to apply for, their spouse wants to apply for them and petition for them, but that person maybe entered one time when they were 18, stayed for a year and a half, and then left, and then came back again. That person then has what's called a permanent bar. And it's not technically a permanent bar, but basically for most people, it ends up being a permanent bar because in order for them to be able to change their status through a family petition, which would be a U.S. citizen applying for a spouse is a family petition. In order for them to be able to change their status on that, they would have to leave the country for 10 years and then apply for admission to the country and ask for a waiver as well at the same time. So most people, if they're in that kind of situation, either do not want to or are not in a position to be able to leave the country for 10 years before they can come back, or before they can even ask to get a waiver to be able to come back. However, if that person was then in a labor situation where they were trafficked after their second entry into the United States, and they reported that trafficking, then through the process of the T visa, they could get that permanent bar waived and not have to process outside the country like people often have to do with family visas, and being afraid to return to their home country either because of the trafficking or other reasons. Then that allows them to stay in the United States, not have to do the consular processing, and waiving that permanent bar that they would have had if they'd tried to apply through their family member. So looking at just a comparison of the advantages that both T and U visa have, some good advantages for the U visa is the ability to adjust to permanent resident status after 3 years of having the U visa and then being continuously physically present in the United States. So once a person receives the U visa and stays in the United States for 3 years with that status, then they can apply for permanent residence. There also, we'll talk about a little bit later, that there is a very long waiting list for U visas. And even though there is a long waiting list, one advantage they have during that waiting list, as opposed to certain family petitions that also have very, very long waiting lists, is that once they get past the first step of the application and their application is reviewed and maybe there's just the visa numbers aren't available for them that year, while they're waiting for those to become available, they can be given what's called deferred action. And in that, it's basically a promise from the government that says, we're not going to actively try to deport you during this time. You can apply for a work permit while you're waiting for your visa. So it doesn't give them any sort of ability to travel out of the country or anything like that, but at least they have that ability to work and feel a little bit more stable while they're waiting for their visa to become available. U visas also have the great ability to consular process. So if somebody is a victim of a qualifying crime and then they leave the country for some reason, either they're deported or they voluntarily decide to leave the country, if they can get a certification and get the application in, they can apply from abroad. And then they can still, once everything is approved and gone through, then they can consular process, which means they go through the consulate to, get the actual visa and get permission to come into the United States. And then they can have the permission to come back in. And then the same thing for derivatives. They can apply for derivatives to consular process and come in from outside the United States as well. T visas also have the ability to adjust to permanent residence, but they have actually two ways they can adjust. Either the same with the U visa, where they've had the 3 years in T status and then the continuous physical presence during those 3 years, or if they did report the trafficking and the investigation is complete, if they can get a confirmation from the Department of Justice that the investigation is complete in their case, they can apply for residency immediately after the T visa is granted. So this is going back to looking at whether or not to report trafficking. even if somebody, it's always going to be a traumatic experience, right? But to use the trauma exception or to use the exception of the, being a minor is going to ultimately be the client's choice. But one thing they would want to think about is, if they don't report it, then they do not have this ability to be able to apply for residency immediately after getting the T visa. They'd have to do the normal process of waiting the 3 years and having the continuous physical presence. Another advantage of T visas is that even though they do have a lower annual limit than U visas, that limit has never actually been reached. And so I don't even think I've ever come anywhere near it. So it's a much faster process, basically, to apply for a T visa. Right now, it's processing it just over a year for them to make a decision on T visa applications. Again, we talked a little bit before as well about certification not being necessary. So even though you do need to report if you're an adult about what happened with the trafficking, they're getting a signed certification by law enforcement saying, yes, this person was a victim of trafficking isn't necessary. So even if they decline to investigate or decline to look into the situation, as long as you can show that you reported it and that you made yourself available as much as possible, even if it's just saying, hey, this happened to me, then you do not have to have that signed certification to be able to apply. It's not a requirement. And again, the being able to get that continued presence can be such a huge advantage for T visa applicants because it is able to provide them with more stability during the application process because they can have that work permit and they don't have to wait with this instability and unknowing what is going to happen. There's always that feeling of, you never know what's going to happen with immigration. But at least if they're able to get this continued presence, they can have a work permit, try to find a job, get some stability in their life in order to be able to complete this T visa process. And then again, they also have those additional possibilities for derivatives if there is the fear that something might happen to them because of the trafficking that they suffered. Now, some disadvantages. There are always disadvantages in every application. For both T and U visas, a disadvantage is having to report. Reporting is a traumatic experience in of itself and can be really difficult for anybody, either because of the crime that they suffered and just because of the nature of both of these visas. People had to have suffered something pretty horrific for them to qualify. And so reporting it, going over details again, and then the whole process of the application, having to go through again and again what happened to them is a really difficult process. And so it can be a deterrent for people. U visas, kind of touched on a little bit, but there is an incredibly long waiting list for U visas. They have a 10,000 cap every year for the number of visas that they can give. But at the end of fiscal year 2017, there were over 110,000 pending applications. So that means over a 10-year wait for anybody who's applying right now for a U visa. Now that, again, they can get that deferred action after they've reviewed their application and maybe said, okay, it appears that you're eligible and you qualify for a U visa, but we don't have any available, so you can have this deferred action. But even that takes several years. It's probably taking, I think, around 3 or 4 years right now. And so even that takes longer than the entire T visa process, just for them to even review the application, and then let alone having to wait then additional years to get the visa. And then again, they have to have the signed certification to be able to apply. If you cannot get that certification, then you just cannot apply for a U visa. And so, especially with minors, or again with the people who have suffered so much trauma as a result of it, if they did qualify for both a U visa and a T visa, but um, you know, it, if it's a minor and they just really, really feel that they cannot report what happened to them because it's a family member or because of, for whatever reason, they really feel that they cannot report that, then you can still pursue the T visa, even though maybe they won't be able to do that automatic application for the residency right afterwards, but they still have the possibility of getting the T visa, um, even if they feel that they cannot report it. Some disadvantages the main disadvantage actually for T visas is that you cannot consular process. So, like I was explaining about U visas, if somebody leaves the country either in the process of a U visa or can somehow get the application done from outside the country, then they can still wait that time period outside the country and then consular process, get through, everything and come back into the country. But for T visas, you cannot do that because one of the requirements is that you have to show that you're in the country on account of the trafficking. Now that doesn't mean you have to have been trafficked into the country, but you have to show that your continued presence in the United States is because of the trafficking. So either that means that you're continuing to need um, therapy or services because of what happened to you as a result of the trafficking. But if you've left the country, then you no longer qualify and there's no ability to get it. Now, that doesn't mean derivative applicants can't. As long as the principal applicant is still in the country, then derivative applicants can consular process. But the principal applicant, the person who actually suffered the trafficking, cannot have left the country. And that includes if the person, say, going back to my example earlier, the person came into the country, the trafficking happened on their first entry, they left and then came back after that, then they still don't qualify for a T visa unless they came back because of the trafficking as well. Um, if they left and then just came back because their financial situation required it or something, or they met somebody or whatever. But if they came back and it wasn't specifically directly related to that trafficking, then they still can't apply for the T visa. So, Ty, are there any questions from that last part?
Yes, so the first question is, can a person reapply for a T visa after it gets denied?
Yes, you can. There's no limit on being able to apply. There is also the possibility of asking for reconsideration. So if it
Mm.
gets denied, then you can go through a process of asking the Vermont Service Center to reconsider the application and explain why you think that they made the wrong decision. Or you can also appeal it to the Administrative Appeals Office.
And I'm
And
assuming there's like a time limit
yeah,
to when you can do that.
yes, there's a time limit.
Okay.
So, mhm.
All right. Another question. So, what if a minor client already has DACA status? Should they apply for a T visa?
Yes. DACA is not permanent. And in fact, the president has been pretty clear that it's going away. And so if they have any other possibility to apply for something, then they definitely should.
Okay. No other questions. Thank you,
Okay.
Lisa.
All right. So going on to say you are working with somebody who has been a victim of trafficking and they are working with an attorney and are filing a T visa, what can you as advocates do to help with that? Now, the first and probably the biggest part of that is offering support, both emotional support, helping them find therapy if it's needed. Um, like I said, this whole process of applying for a T visa and sometimes even a U visa can be incredibly traumatic. And so helping that person to have support and feeling that some sort of stability in their lives is a huge, huge help, especially because attorneys generally don't cannot offer that kind of assistance. And so even trying to be trauma informed in the process of and being an attorney that's more trauma informed, the process as it's written and required makes still limits the ability of attorneys to be as trauma informed as maybe we want to. And again, the second point, trauma, the whole process is very traumatic for people. And so being able to, again, offer that support is huge. Offering letters of support if you're providing services to somebody, and especially if it's directly related to them being a victim of trafficking, it can be really helpful to show that that they're still in the country as a result of the trafficking, because they're continuing to need services to stabilize themselves and be able to get the help that they need here. So that can be very helpful in the application process. And also, if you're able to, getting them help with housing, especially if they've been a victim of labor trafficking, a lot of times housing goes along with labor trafficking, control of their housing. And so if they leave that situation, then a huge worry to a lot of people is, where are they going to live? How are they going to find some place to stay? And so being able to get help with that is really helpful, because again, attorneys just cannot help with that kind of thing. And we don't know how a lot of the time. So having the assistance of advocates is really helpful. And then also just helping with getting documents, police reports, protective orders, anything's from the court that might have been filed, helping getting copies of all of those to help with the documentation of what happened to this person is really helpful, especially if you're not located in the Twin Cities. A lot of immigration attorneys are in the Twin Cities, and so therefore it's harder for them to get documentation from towns that are more outstate. And so if the person has somebody that they're working with that can help them get those documents, it's really helpful in the process. Okay, let's go back. Any questions from that?
No.
Okay. All right, so then let's go to our two case examples. So the first one is Julio. Julio is a 16-year-old from El Salvador. He came to the United States at 14 and is living with his uncle. He is having difficulty in school because he falls asleep every day in class. He finally confessed to a teacher that he falls asleep every day because he cannot sleep when he's at home. He has to go to work every night from the time that he leaves school until 2 a.m. And then he has to care for his uncle's child when she wakes up at 5 a.m. until he leaves for school. All of his wages go to his uncle to pay him back for Julio's trip to the United States, for rent, and for food. So this is kind of a combination of several cases that I've seen. And so I think that in this kind of situation, it's maybe not, they're not always the most obvious things. People don't always keep somebody chained up in the basement. It's not always somebody who, has their toenails growing over because they can't even get their toenails clipped because they're being so abused by people. Sometimes it's just this kid who's 16 and he keeps falling asleep in class because he cannot sleep at night because he has to go to work. And then even when he does go home, he gets woken up because he's being forced to take on these familial responsibilities that aren't even his, that shouldn't even be his responsibilities. And then again, looking at it and maybe he's working every single night to the point where he can't even do homework or sleep. But yet all of that money is going to his uncle to pay back a trip from the US or from his home country to the US, paying for rent as a 16-year-old, paying for his own food. Um, you know, children, I've seen this in some cases too, where it's, maybe even a parent who's saying, oh, you have to pay, you have to help pay the rent or you have to help pay for the food. And sometimes that's more of they don't even consider that abnormal because of the mentality of poverty that they've come from. But when you look at it, a child should not have to pay um, for their upkeep. That is an adult caregiver's responsibility. And so if they're being forced to work and being tricked to believe that they have to do this, and that if they don't, they're going to get kicked out and have to live on the streets and or not be able to have somebody take them to their court hearings or and something like that for immigration, then that still would qualify for them as trafficking, even though it's not such a strong. I mean, it is a strong case, but even though it's not such a obvious, I guess, would be the word. And then the second example is Alejandra. Alejandra is from Ecuador. When living in Ecuador, her cousin Bernardo, who lives in the US, told her that he had a friend, Juan, who's a US citizen, and he'd seen her picture and wants to marry her. Alejandra's mother is very sick, and her father passed away several years ago. Juan has said that he will pay all of Alejandra's mother's medical expenses if she joins him in the US. And her family puts a lot of pressure on her to go so that she can help provide for them and provide for their mother. Finally, she agrees, and Bernardo makes the arrangements for her to travel to the US. But when she arrives to live with Juan, he makes it clear that he has no intention of marrying her. He does, however, make her become the cook for him and his friends and family who frequently come and go from his house. She gets put in charge of all the household chores, and family members who frequently stay at Juan's home often pull her hair, insult her when she's cooking their meals, cleaning, and doing their laundry. And when she tries to leave, then Juan threatens that he'll no longer pay her mother's medical bills and to tell the family that she left him for another man and shame her. He's locked her passport in a safe, and only he has the key to it. She's not allowed out of the house except to attend mass once per week and to go grocery shopping. And except that anytime she does leave, a family member always has to accompany her. She finally snuck out of the house while everyone was sleeping and came to the local shelter for help. So this again is, she's probably coming and saying she's being abused, right? She's probably saying, I'm living with my partner. He mistreats me. He threatens me. His family doesn't treat me well. And she's probably explaining that, but instead of also necessarily seeing that he's trafficking her. He's turned her into a slave in her own home and uses the threats of not paying her family or not paying her mother's medical bills, and so therefore, threatening basically physical harm to her mother, because if she cannot get her medical expenses paid, then she can't get the treatment that she needs. And then also controlling her movements, not feeling free to come and go, and controlling her passport. If she doesn't have any sort of ID and she doesn't have any access to get that, a lot of people are really afraid to leave. And so, a common thing that Alejandra might present with is saying that she needs help because she's in this abusive relationship. But then it turns out that she does have this other issue of trafficking as well. So, um, that is it for this webinar. This is my contact information, Ty's contact, and our action line. Again, I take cases for youth who are under 24 or 24 and under for labor trafficking cases and doing TV visas, but I'm also available if you're working with a client who has an attorney and they're a little unsure of what's supposed to be happening in the case, then I'm also available to speak with other attorneys throughout the state to help. And then we are also getting a group of volunteer attorneys to take T visa cases that perhaps don't qualify for me to take them. So if there's ever a question of whether or not somebody might have been trafficked and qualify for a T visa, then we're I'm available to talk with that person and discuss the possibilities that they might have. Any final questions?
We do. We have one final question, and that kind of helps us close up the webinar as well. So if we suspect someone is being trafficked, who should we report the trafficking to?
So it depends. There are various agencies that you can report to, and it really just depends on, what kind of situation it is. You can either report to the local law enforcement. Sometimes you can report to the Department of Labor if it's labor trafficking, the FBI. Um, I really strongly suggest advocates can help people report, but I think it's also really a good idea to speak with an attorney to discuss the best place to report as well, because sometimes it's just either easier or, some places require an interview based on a report. And so, depending on a person's situation, one reporting to one place may just be less traumatic for them than reporting somewhere else. And so it's always a good idea to check with an attorney as well. Any other questions?
No, that was our last question.
Okay. Ty, did you have ending questions or
No, there,
poll?
there isn't any follow-up questions to the webinar, but again, I want to suggest to anyone listening, if you do have topics that you would like us to present on, please shoot me an email and that we can plan on doing something for that topic.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
All right, I'm going to end the webinar now. Thanks. Bye.